Welcome everybody to my second edition of Kaiju Corner, where we will be wrapping up my Monsters Around the World special, taking a look at kind of a potpourri of monsters from all over the world, from various different countries and continents, not so much focused on Japan. And today we will be going over a few very special films to me, with some pretty big names in the genre of giant monster movies. And we're going to start things off with a couple of American films with special effects provided by the legendary Ray Harryhausen, who is a big hero of mine. And actually, to highlight how highly I think of Ray Harryhausen, when I was a child, in the world of entertainment, and I was just starting to get into movies and television shows and all of that, there were three guys who were my ultimate entertainment heroes as a child, and they were all behind-the-scenes workers. Jim Henson, Mel Blanc, who many of you know was the voice of the Looney Tunes, most of the Looney Tunes, and Ray Harryhausen. Mel Blanc made me fall in love with voice acting, Jim Henson made me fall in love with practical effects, and Ray Harryhausen, with his stop-motion animation, was one of the earliest examples of me being fascinated with how things were made in a movie. Just watching a movie and just going, how'd they do that? And then when I heard how he did it, having all these clay models and specialized models that he made and filming them one frame at a time, a process that took hours and hours and hours and hours and hours, I was just blown away that that much work could go into creating a movie monster. And you know a Ray Harryhausen film when you're looking at it, just looking at the special effects and looking at the way the characters move and the life that he gave those models and those figurines that he designed. It never ceased to amaze me. And yes, the effects are dated by today's standards, but again, it's the amount of work that went into them that make them so memorable and make them so endearing even to this day. I remember the first time I saw Clash of the Titans, and it was the movie that made me fall in love with Greek mythology. And when I saw things like the Kraken and Medusa, and Calibos and the giant scorpions and all the other creatures, the Pegasus, all the different things that are showcased in that film, and I was like, man, this is awesome. And that was among his later works. This guy worked for decades, working so hard on these movies, and oftentimes it felt like the studios kind of wrote the scripts or designed the movies to work around the special. It's like, all right, we want Ray Harryhausen to make this thing first, and we'll just write a story around it. I think the prime example of that is It Came From Beneath the Sea. I think that movie was pitched and designed entirely for Ray Harryhausen to do a giant octopus, and for no other reason. And that's it. But the octopus looks great. And that's the other thing about his movies. Some of these movies would be probably forgettable and kind of like just get lost in the shuffle with everything else that came out at the time period. But it's his special effects that really set them apart and really make them worth checking out. So even his weaker movies, I highly recommend checking them out, because his effects work was never weak, ever. I could sit here all day and talk about Ray Harryhausen movies that I love, with Mysterious Island, I mentioned Clash of the Titans, my personal favorite, probably Jason of the Argonauts, It Came From Beneath the Sea, on and on and on, just so many. But there are two films that I picked for my kaiju movie reviews, my monster movie reviews, that I thought would be great showcases for Ray Harryhausen's work, as well as great examples of giant monsters in the world of cinema. And we're going to start off with the classic, the legendary, The Beast from 20,000 Fathoms, featuring the Radosaurus, the creature that has been named the Radosaurus, presumably named after Ray Harryhausen himself. And this is the movie that, to me, signifies a passing of the torch from Willis O'Brien, who was the special effects designer on the original King Kong, to Ray Harryhausen. And this is the movie that really got Ray Harryhausen's big break and big start and becoming kind of the king of stop motion special effects. And the dinosaur, the creature that's on display here, is one of, for me personally, one of the greatest movie monsters ever put on film. The Radosaurus, and again, it's all in the animation, how it moves, like the scene at the lighthouse and the scene of it walking down the street in the city. All amazing stuff. And I'm sure, even if you've never seen the movie, I guarantee you've seen footage of this film. The first time I saw footage of this film, and this is probably something you're going to hear a lot, I'm sure I've mentioned it before, there was a special called Classic Creatures Return of the Jedi, which detailed the behind-the-scenes making of Return of the Jedi, which was fascinating. If you're interested at all in practical special effects, I highly recommend checking it out if you can get your hands on it, because it was really a fascinating look behind the scenes of not only how they did certain things for Return of the Jedi, but where George Lucas drew a lot of his inspirations for the special effects. Godzilla was referenced. The Creature from the Black Lagoon was referenced, and the Beast from 20,000 Fathoms was referenced. That was the first time I saw footage of it, and it's that famous shot of the Radosaurus reaching down as the cop is shooting at him. The Radosaurus reaches down and plucks it up in his mouth. A scene that I'm sure inspired the T-Rex in Jurassic Park as well. And it really, Beast from 20,000 Fathoms is one of those grandfather films. It's one of those trendsetters that really set the stage for what was to come. This movie came out in 1954. I believe, let me double check that. I'm pretty sure it was 1954. 1953, probably. Let's see. I want to make sure I get this right. Because 1954 was Godzilla. This is not, okay, so this is my mistake. It was 1953. So this movie came out a year before Godzilla. Godzilla was clearly inspired by the Beast from 20,000 Fathoms. And, you know, Godzilla would come around, basically do a Japanese version of the Beast from 20,000 Fathoms. And basically, and by doing that, Japan created its whole brand, its own cinematic brand of science fiction. So the Beast from 20,000 Fathoms, and you know, you look at all the B movies and all the giant monster movies that came out in its wake, and there's one other one I'm going to talk about coming up on this list that was clearly heavily inspired from the Beast from 20,000 Fathoms, to the film's detriment. But you know, if you didn't get this film, would we have gotten Godzilla? Would we have gotten Gorgo? Would we have gotten many of the other Japanese tokusatsu films? Would we have gotten many of the 1950s, you know, nuclear exploitation films with, you know, movies like them and all of Ray Harryhausen's other work? I don't know, but this movie is such a trendsetter, and the only criticism I can see people having of it is that it is very much cut from the same cloth as all the other movies that were coming out at around the same time. But The Beast from 20,000 Fathoms inspired a lot of those films and did it better than a lot of those films. And if you're in it just for the monster, this movie, and that's one thing about Ray Harryhausen, this guy did not shy away from showing off his creations. He loved to show off the monsters. And hey, if I poured as many man hours into bringing that thing to life, I'd want to show it off too. And The Beast from 20,000 Fathoms, it's not even the best example of Ray Harryhausen's work. Again, I would look to something like the Skeleton Warriors and Jason and the Argonauts, or Medusa and Clash of the Titans, but it is a very early example of what he was capable of and the type of work that he just poured into these films. He clearly loved what he did, and he had to have loved what he did to be able to do such great work. So if you're a fan of monster movies, to me, The Beast from 20,000 Fathoms, it's sort of like Night of the Living Dead is to zombie movies. You kind of have to watch it. And again, you know, no Beast from 20,000 Fathoms, you know, Jurassic Park, Godzilla, so many other things we probably wouldn't have gotten. So for being a trendsetter and for being one of the most important films in its genre, I think The Beast from 20,000 Fathoms is required viewing for any fan. The other Harryhausen film that I wanted to cover is 20 Million Miles to Earth. Wow, they really like to work 20 into those number titles. I love the hyperbolic you know, and again, it's very much cut from the 1950s. Just the Beast from 20,000 Fathoms, 20 million miles to Earth, and that whole, like, very sensational, very, again, of its era, and it's just so charming. But this movie came out in 1957 and features a creature called the Emir, which starts off as like an alien blob or pod or whatever. And it evolves throughout the film, starting as a small creature, then it becomes human-sized, and then as it grows, it becomes more destructive and causes more chaos, and it gets to the end where it becomes a full-fledged giant and does battle with an elephant, which is one of the film's highlights. And I remember watching this movie on TV in my teens, and I'd never seen it before. And there was that scene in the farmhouse where the Emir does battle with a dog, and he kills the dog. And it's something about that just seems so brutal. And I don't know, maybe it's because today's culture is a lot more PC. Like, openly being so brutal to an animal is something I feel like they wouldn't get away with today. But that kind of makes this movie a lot cooler. It's like, oh, look at that, he killed an elephant and he killed a dog and all this other crazy stuff. And it's really just a very simple movie about a monster that grows. It's kind of like the Blob in a way, but instead of a blob, it's this lizard like alien creature, but it's just about this creature that crash lands on Earth and then just evolves and grows and grows and grows and becomes more destructive as the movie progresses. And again, the creature's fantastically done, again, with all the action sequences that they had to do with this thing, especially dealing with like a real dog, and doing a while the elephant was a model too, doing a somewhat photorealistic elephant, about as photorealistic as it could possibly get in 1957, with stop motion effects. And with so much work put into it, I think the Emir is another example of the high quality of Ray Harryhausen's work. And really, and I could sit here all day and talk about Ray Harryhausen movies and how I feel like y'all need to just go out there and just watch as much of his stuff as possible. But the point of these reviews is to focus on the giant monsters, and I picked two very, very good ones. So if you're looking for recommendations of Harryhausen movies to check out, you can't go wrong with Beast from 20,000 Fathoms and 20 Million Miles to Earth. Or really, again, Jason and the Argonauts, Clash of the Titans, the Sinbad movies. You're in good company. As long as it has Harryhausen's name in it. Mysterious Island, another great example. As long as it has his name on it, at the very least, you're going to get worthwhile special effects and just remarkable special effects of their era and of their time. So, those are two movies I highly recommend checking out, though. Beast from 20,000 Fathoms. How many times have I said that? I feel like I'm being overly repetitive, but that movie I think is absolutely a must-see. 20 Million Miles to Earth, not quite as good, but definitely worth checking out, especially if you're a fan of his. So both movies get a thumbs up from me. And again, maybe one day I'll go back and review a whole shit ton of Ray Harryhausen movies, because I just love the man's work. Next up on the list is that movie I was talking about earlier that was clearly heavily inspired by the Beast from 20,000 Fathoms, and that's the giant Behemoth, which very interestingly, want to make sure I get the names right. The giant Behemoth was directed by the same man who directed the Beast from 20,000 Fathoms, Eugene Laurie. Lorne, it's a very weird sounding name. Eugene Laurie, that's how I'm going to pronounce it. It has accent marks on it, but I'm sure I'm probably saying that wrong, but, I apologize. So you have the same director as Ray Harryhausen's first major special effects-driven film, where he was in charge of the special effects. And you also have Willis O'Brien in charge of the special effects. So the guy that inspired Ray Harryhausen is doing the special effects for this film, and you get a stop-motion creature here. Unfortunately, like I mentioned earlier, to the film's detriment, it was clearly a ripoff of The Beast from 20,000 Fathoms. So because of that, the movie has no originality of its own, and the special effects aren't even as good. Clearly a much lower budget film. This was a cross-produced film with, I believe the live action scenes were all filmed in Britain, and the special effects scenes were done in America, so you get like a cross-country flavor there. But nothing, because it is so similar to Beast from 20,000 Fathoms, but none of it is as good. Like, again, just look at the two monsters and look at the animation of the two monsters. Look at how alive and the design and the detail that went into the Rhedosaurus, and then look at the giant Behemoth, and it's like, yeah, it just doesn't look as good. And it doesn't help that the title of the movie is nowhere near as sexy. Because again, how many times have I said the title of The Beast from 20,000 Fathoms just in the early portion of this video? I like saying that title. It's just a cool sounding title. It makes me want to see the movie. Giant Behemoth literally could be anything. Like, it literally could be any generic monster movie. They could have called Godzilla that. They could have called 20 Million Miles to Earth that. They could have called... virtually any giant monster movie could have been called The Giant Behemoth. So, boring title, somewhat boring film, clearly heavily inspired to the point of feeling like a ripoff of a much better film and a much better example of the giant monster movie that I can't really strongly recommend it. I only reviewed it as part of this list because I remember watching it as a kid. And actually, it's so similar to Beast that... I used to confuse the two when I was a kid. I remember watching The Giant Behemoth, and I thought it was The Beast from 20,000 Fathoms, because it looked similar enough to where I mistook the two movies. And obviously, now that I'm older, with a keener eye, I can spot the differences from a mile away, because clearly one is way more polished. But... yeah, it's just kind of a forgettable movie, and one that I really can't highly recommend all that much, just because it is kind of dull, it is kind of boring. And if you see The Beast from 20,000 Fathoms, you're basically seeing a much better version of this, so there's no reason to really go out of your way to see this. Now, next up, we're going to be going into North Korea. They've been in the news lately, haven't they? For the majority of Trump's presidency, they seem to be in the news. They seem to always be in the news, though. They're a very interesting country, very, very interesting socio-political goings-on in North Korea. There always seems to be. But we're going to be covering a North Korean monster movie called Pulgasari, made in 1985. Now, let me start off by saying that this movie... how it got made is way more interesting than the movie itself. The movie itself is cheesy, silly, kind of fun for how cheesy and silly it is. I would even recommend checking it out just for how ridiculous it is. And it is kind of weirdly fun in its own odd way. It was made in the mid-'80s. Looks like it was made in the mid-'60s. It's a bizarre film, but... the story of how it got made, I want to see a movie about that story. So if you don't know what happened, basically, and I want to make sure I get the names right here. And by the way, I'll post a link to the article in the description, and just read the article for yourselves, because it is a bizarre story, to say the least. But, okay, Kim Jong-il. You've heard of him, right? Kim Jong-il was a bit of a movie fan and was fascinated with using film not only to tell stories that he wanted to tell, but also force his anti-capitalist, pro-Korea, pro-North Korea propaganda. And he was very interested in using film for propaganda, which is not unheard of. I mean, if you look at World War II era American film and cartoons and all that stuff, so not unheard of, but he was very fascinated by film and really wanted to utilize it. And he became a fan of the work of a South Korean director by the name of Shin Sang-ok. And again, I apologize if I'm mispronouncing any of these. So as the story goes, North Korea kidnapped his ex-wife, this director's ex-wife, who's a famous actress in South Korea, knowing that it would draw his attention, and in doing so, they were able to lure him close to the country, where they were able to capture him, and they put them in, like, camps, and forced them to kind of assimilate to the way things are done in North Korea. And Kim Jong-il wanted him to produce propaganda films for North Korea, starring his famous ex-wife in these films. So they were basically prisoners being forced to make propaganda films for a crazy person. I mean, this is insane. They were forced to get remarried, which is another part of the story I find fascinating, that he forced them to remarry, and they had to work together on these forced productions that were ultimately propaganda films for North Korea. One of those films with Pulgasari, although his ex-wife, well, then actual wife, again, she was not in Pulgasari, but still, it's like, I could not imagine living under those circumstances, being forced to make movies for a madman. And shortly after Pulgasari wrapped up, he was able to, both of them were finally able to flee to America and claim political asylum. And supposedly he was afraid to go back to South Korea because he was worried of being branded a traitor and that they wouldn't welcome him back. Because they would have thought that it would have been hard for him to prove that he made those movies as like he was forced to make those movies. It would be hard to prove that. And it's like, you know, you listen to this whole story and it's like, what the fuck? This is so weird. And apparently this guy, after claiming asylum in America, went on to become a director and executive producer on the Three Ninjas sequels. He was an executive producer on Three Ninjas, High Noon at Mega Mountain, which starred Jim Varney, Ernest P. Worrell, Lonnie Anderson, who some of you may know from WKRP in Cincinnati, and Hulk fucking Hogan. Hulk Hogan. So, weirdly, in doing Kaiju movie reviews, everything circles back to pro wrestling. I found a connection from a North Korean monster movie to Hulk Hogan. It's very strange. And there are not nearly enough degrees in between those two things. Not as much as you would like. So this story is just fascinating to me. I would love to see a movie made about this dude's time in North Korea and how he was forced to make movies. And I would love for there to be a lot of focus on Pulgasari, because obviously I'm a giant monster movie fan. So now let's actually talk about the movie itself, because I feel like I blew my load early, because it's like the movie sounds boring by comparison, but again, it's a very cheesy film about villagers and the common folk trying to overthrow an oppressive empire. And they make allies with this creature that starts off small and eats metal and iron, and the more it eats, the larger it becomes. And the Pulgasari becomes a great ally in the war against this oppressive regime, and ultimately helps them overthrow it. Unfortunately, Pulgasari, because he constantly needs to eat metal and he constantly keeps getting bigger, he's draining the country of supplies, and the relationship with Pulgasari is no longer sustainable, so the villagers are going to have to find a way to get rid of Pulgasari. And apparently the entire thing is just one big anti-capitalist message, where it's like, yeah, it might seem great, but it's unsustainable because you blow through all your resources and you get too big to sustain itself, and various other things. So here we go. We have a monster movie that takes a harsh stance against capitalism. I friggin' love it. Special effects wise, Pulgasari, again, it's very cheesy, kind of low budget, but it is a fun, weird movie to watch. And again, I can't stress enough how fascinated I am by the story of how this movie got made, which is, again, way more interesting than the movie itself. But Pulgasari, I think I found it on YouTube, if I'm not mistaken. Let me just make sure. We can find it on here, because I don't want to misdirect anybody. I remember seeing it on YouTube. Let's see if it's there. If it is, I'll post a link in the description as well. Yep, there it is. Yep, that's actually the video I watched. Okay, so you can find Pulgasari on YouTube. I highly recommend checking that out and then reading about how this story happened. I'll post a link to the article I pulled from in the description as well. Pulgasari is a very interesting footnote in the history of giant monster movies. So, but very interesting to say the least. Now let's head back to South Korea, where we've got one classic age monster movie and one new age monster movie. Let's start with Yongary, which is a movie that recently got lampooned on Mystery Science Theater in the new season on Netflix. Almost feels long overdue. I don't know how Yongary escaped Mystery Science Theater prior to this, but according to the Wikipedia page, and I found this interesting, according to the Wikipedia, the South Korean version of the film is considered lost, and so the English version is considered the definitive version of the film, which is kind of sad. You would want the original language version to be the one that survives, but in any case, Yongary is a very basic monster movie inspired by everything else that had come out before it, Godzilla. I'm sure there's a little bit of Gamera in there as well. And it's about scientists that unleash this dinosaur-like creature named Yongary, who's kind of goofy looking, and he runs around causing chaos and destroying Korea in his search for food. Ultimately, it turns out he's just really, really hungry, and he's destroying all these cities looking for food. There's a kid thrown in who knows how to beat the monster, as kids always do in these movies, and is able to find out his weaknesses. Also gets Yongary to dance at one point in the movie's strangest scene, one of the stranger monster movie scenes I've ever seen, where the young boy actually encourages and dances with Yongary. It's very weird, very strange. Yeah, this is one of those weird, like, outlier monster movies, kind of like Gappa, kind of like The X from Outer Space, like I talked about in part 1. But this one has a bit of a following, I found. Like, Yongary's one of the, I don't want to call it a significant name in the pantheon of, giant monster movies, but it's a name I always see pop up, and it actually got a remake in the early 2000s. Actually, I think it was 1999. So right before the turn of the millennium, this movie got a remake and a reboot. The monsters are CGI and it looks terrible, and I don't recommend checking that out. I saw it on the Sci-Fi Channel years ago and it was awful. And I was like, nope, it's not. Okay, if Yongary was inspired by Godzilla, the original, then the remake was inspired by the 1998 TriStar Godzilla. Why anybody would draw inspiration from that, I don't know. But the original Yongary, probably worth a look, just for... it's a fairly competently made film with some really weird, funny moments and a lot of cheesiness. And again, it's a name that's known in among giant monster movie fans, so I would probably recommend checking it out. And if you're into riffing, check out the Mystery Science Theater version on Netflix, because that was pretty good as well. And then from there, we're going to go into a more modern classic from South Korea. The Host came out in 2006. And no, I am not referencing the Stephenie Meyer's book or film that came out here in America. This is a movie about a giant tadpole-like creature that is terrorizing Korea and breaking up families and attacking and devouring small children, among other things. And apparently there's also a political message attached to this one, too. This one against America, where I want to make sure I'm pulling the correct information. This film was in part inspired by an incident in 2000 in which a Korean mortician working for the U.S. military dumped a large amount of formaldehyde down the drain. In addition to its environmental concerns, this caused some antagonism toward the United States. So, I guess that's kind of a theme where, much like how Godzilla was born as a reaction to the disasters that happened at the end of World War II with us dropping the bomb, this was kind of like reacting to America, and then you get a monster movie out of it. It's kind of neat in a weird way. USA, USA, we fuck up and then giant monsters are born. Which is kind of what the giant monster movies are typically about, where it's like, ah, man, you're ruining the earth and blah, blah, blah. And it causes a giant monster. So it's, it's always... everything relates to each other, I guess. But anyway, The Host was the first movie I ever watched on Netflix, which is interesting. Unfortunately, I checked right before I started filming. It is no longer available on Netflix, which is kind of disappointing, because it's one of those ones I would have liked to revisit every so often. And anyway, it's the first movie I watched on Netflix. I'd heard rumblings about it, that it was something I needed to check out. And I was very happy with the film when I saw it. It's a movie that features a completely CGI monster, but the CGI monster looks fantastic. These are some of the best CGI effects I've ever seen for a monster. And the destructive power of this tadpole creature, you know, I described it as a giant tadpole. It's really not much bigger than... it's not even like King Kong sized. It's a giant tadpole, but it's not much bigger than normal sized people compared to like Godzilla and various other things. And but the destruction that the monster causes, just going around openly attacking people and targeting people and using them for sustenance, kind of scary and kind of weird to see. And then you see this family that gets broken up and ruined as the monster takes the daughter of the main family that's the focus of this film, and she makes friends with the small child, becomes like a big sister to him. And so there's a lot of like themes of family and togetherness and unity and love and all that other fun stuff, but it feels genuine. I actually felt something for the family in this film, and I think that's what really helped put it over the top and make it one of the better monster movies I've seen in the modern era. And again, don't get this confused with the Stephenie Meyers film. Granted, I didn't see that version of The Host, but I'm sure it's a piece of shit because it has Stephenie Meyers' name attached to it. I know that's a dick thing to say, but there you go. If you want to see a cool monster, I think this thing, whatever it is, as far as I know, and I couldn't find an official name for this thing. And all I could say, it's kind of fish-like, kind of amphibian-like, kind of looks like a giant tadpole. And you gotta love a creature that's mutated by formaldehyde pouring down the drain. You gotta appreciate that. It's kind of as ridiculous as that idea sounds. It is kind of, you know, not too uncommon for giant monster movies like this anyway. So The Host, I was pleasantly surprised by it. I think it's one of the better non-Japanese, non-American giant monster movie, probably the best one. If we're cutting Japan and America out of it, it's probably the best giant monster movie I've ever seen. Really good stuff. I highly recommend checking it out. Again, the monster's very cool. I think the emotional core of the story works. I think the special effects are great. So it has everything you could want in a good old-fashioned creature feature. So check it out. I highly recommend it. And then from there, we go into back to Japan, and we're going to go into Dai Studios, the ones that were most well known for producing the Gamera films. But we're going to close out by talking about a trilogy of films that I've known about for years and years and years, but I didn't finally watch until about a year ago. And that was the Daimajin Trilogy. I'd always known that Daimajin existed, and then the creature always fascinated me, but I just never got around to watching these films. Daimajin, the monster in question, is a giant stone statue that's possessed by an ancient god and has the powers of a god, and it takes its wrath against humanity when called upon and whenever pushed to do so. And you got this trilogy of films, all of which came out in 1966, so they just push these things right out there. And what fascinated me before even having watched the films, I like the idea of a stone idol coming to life and killing people. That was great. Very atypical of like the dinosaurs and insects and bug monsters and cyborgs and various other things that I was used to seeing out of kaiju films. I was like, oh, that's neat, a giant stone idol. That's actually really cool. And I was also interested that it was that these movies are set in feudal Japan. Which kind of gives it an Akira Kurosawa kind of Seven Samurai feel to it. And again, that's very different from every other movie I'm covering here, because most monster movies are set in modern times, whatever the modern time is of when the film is being produced, and it's all about trashing giant cities. Here you don't have that. It's just basic farming communities and basic forts and stone towers and mountains and fields and rivers and islands and various other things. And it was again, gives these movies a very different feel that most giant monster movies don't have. Another thing that drew me to this is when I heard that Akira Ifukube, the famed Godzilla music composer, composed the score for these films. And spoiler alert, does an amazing job. The music in these films are great. And that fascinated me because really it's kind of the closest in a movie that we've ever gotten to a Godzilla Gamera crossover, because you have the studio that produces the Gamera films with the composer of the Godzilla films. And it's God, we're so close. If we could have just gotten it together, could have gotten Godzilla and Gamera, it would have been great. But this is, cinematically speaking, this is the closest we've ever gotten, is that partnership of Akira Ifukube working with Daiei Studios. And now I will say that I expected these films to not look very good and to look like they look fairly cheap, mainly because I'm going by how the creatures looked in the Gamera films, which, as I've said before, they're designed well. I mean, Giron has a great design. Gauss has a great design. Zigra has a great design. It's just that they didn't look as alive and they didn't look as good as the Toho monsters. They looked like they were made out of styrofoam and like they were made on the cheap. So I expected the Daimajin films to look similarly cheap. They did not. I was blown away at how good these films looked. And again, maybe it's the feudal Japan setting that helped out with that. Maybe it's the fact that the monster itself typically doesn't show up until the end. I'll talk about the formula for these movies in a bit. But I think these movies look really, really good and really, really impressive. And when it comes time for the stone idol to come to life and go to town and really cause some destruction, you get some really great stuff there. And it's probably the best special effects work I've seen come out of the studio, at least during this era. And I guess now I'll talk about the formula of the films, because if I do have one criticism about this trilogy, it's that you get 3 movies that are basically standalone stories, so there's not like a continuity from film to film, which would be okay, except they all kind of follow the same formula, where bad guys oppress people, people are brought down to their lowest point, people try to oppose, get stopped, and then the bad guys go too far. And there's the stone idol there to represent Daimajin and the god that the good people pray to. And then the bad people go too far and deface the statue or destroy the statue, do something to anger the god, and then Daimajin comes to life and wrecks their shit in the last 10-15 minutes of the movie. And basically gets his vengeance upon them, and the villains are defeated. And that's basically the same basic story structure in each and every film. So I could see people like feeling like they just basically watched the same movie 3 times. Certain aspects are changed, but overall it does kind of feel like watching the same movie 3 times. But it's so well done, I don't really mind all that much. And again, if you're one of those people that don't like it when the monster is kept out of the spotlight for most of the movie, you're probably not going to like these, because literally Daimajin does not show up until the very end of the movie, when it comes time to really take his vengeance upon the bad people, the oppressive folk. And those scenes are very impressive, but you got to wait until the end of the film to really get it. Now, my personal favorite of the 3 is the first movie, because again, I saw it first. And again, I was really impressed not only in the build-up to get to the stone statue, but in just how like well executed the story was, and how villainous they made the bad guys look, to where it's like you really wanted to see Daimajin destroy these people. It kind of reminds me of the 4th Rambo film, where they made the bad guys so bad that it was like you just wanted Rambo to just liquefy them. But the build-up is very good. The setting is great. The set pieces look amazing, and it's a really good film. Like, I think it's definitely worth checking out. And again, once you get to the ending where the stone statue comes to life and starts wrecking shit, it is very impressive. I can't stress enough how good those scenes are in each film. The second movie, again, very similar story structure. There is that awesome shot, which I swear must have been inspired by the 10 Commandments, where they blow up the stone statue and blow it to pieces, and it looks like they're trying to trick us, like Daimajin's not going to show up this time. But like at the end of the movie, when the statue rises, and you get almost like the parting of the Red Sea as the statue walks over to go kill the bad guys. And again, more amazing stuff. But this one, more than the third film, which I'll talk about the third film in a bit. But the second film really does feel like more of the same, and is probably the weakest of the three because of it. But there's still, again, it's still a very well-made movie, and the scene with Daimajin at the end is just so great that it's like I recommend checking this one out too. So the second one is called The Return of Daimajin. The third one is called Wrath of Daimajin. And this one changes it up a little bit by making the main characters kids. So you get kind of a Stand By Me feel to it, where these kids are going off to free their fathers who are being held in captivity from the evil, oppressive regime that will serve as the villains of this picture. And they have to go through a mountainside. And again, there is also a kind of a change of setting in each film, where the second movie, the statue's found on an island, and the third movie, it's in a mountain, and various other things. And Daimajin's presence is felt more throughout this film because there's a bird that flies around that represents his presence. And again, you're following these kids throughout the course of the film as they go off to what seems like would be a futile quest to go save their fathers. And but what really worked for me on this one, again, I think by focusing on the kids, it kind of gives it more of a Gamera feel to it without being a cheese fest. This is one monster movie where it stars the kids and it doesn't feel that cheesy or that silly to do that, and it actually kind of works. And again, the scene at the end, one thing that the third movie does that's great, in the first two movies I noticed that the stone statue has a sword, but he never uses it, and I'm like, okay, like, why would you give him a sword and not have him use it? We finally get a payoff to that in Wrath of Daimajin, where in the end he finally breaks out the sword and uses it on a specific person, and it is glorious. It is great. So we finally get that that weapon coming into play, and you get to see a stone statue come to life and use a sword. How great is that? So, yeah. Daimajin is a trilogy. I'm really glad I watched it. I highly recommend checking them out. I got them on Blu-ray, and you can get them on Blu-ray as well. And I can't recommend them enough. I think they're really, really good films. And the only thing I'm upset about is that it took me so long to finally get around to watching these damn things. But yeah, I think these movies are very good. And if you're a fan of giant monsters, I think they're definitely worth checking out. Although, again, they are very different in that they're different setting. The monster doesn't show up until the end in all three movies. So if that puts you off, maybe these won't be for you, but if you're like me at all, you're going to have a blast watching these things. I think they're very different. I think they're very unique among the genre. And if there's any monster crossover I want now, I kind of want Daimajin versus Godzilla. I would love to see Daimajin fight another monster now, because it's like, oh man, because all we've ever seen him do is go after the bad guys and specifically attack people. It was like, God, what if he got into a fight with another monster? It'd be awesome. It'd be fantastic. But yeah, so that will wrap up Monsters Around the World Part 2 and this entry of Kaiju Corner. So now that we're 2 entries in, it's time to head on back to Japan. So starting with the next part, we will specifically be diving into the Toho classics and the films produced by Toho Studios, the non-Godzilla films produced by Toho Studios. A wide variety of monsters came out of there. Rodan, Varan, Mothra, the Gargantuas, Space Amoeba was another one, and various others. I could sit here all day and talk about all the different monsters that came out of Toho that weren't Godzilla. But that'll have to wait until next month, and that is all I have for you now. So thank you all for watching again. Stay tuned for more. I will be back next month where, like I said, we will be kicking off with the Toho classics. So hopefully you enjoyed this, and hopefully you're ready for more, because I've got a lot more lined up for you.